morning. That was lame. Good morning. All right, get everybody awake a little bit. Before we get started, if you could make sure your mobile phones are on vibrate. I always have to remind myself of that. No one wants to hear Bust a Move by Tone Loc playing in the middle of the conversation. Oh, maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe you do. It's good to see all of you out here this morning. Some familiar faces, some new ones. If you are here and you've been here before, welcome back. If you are at the Spy Museum for the first time, a special welcome to you. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the historian and curator here at the International Spy Museum. I'd like to welcome you to the fall series of the Smithsonian Spy Museum collaboration. We try to do these, the fall and the spring and the fall and the spring. And each time they get better. So we're really excited about this time as we're looking at not only great escapes, but more correctly, great escapes and great rescues. Some of the really interesting ways that intelligence and spies have been used to get people out of bad situations. The series actually goes from all the way back to the 1970s to today. Well, actually starting with one that's a little more recent. But next week, we'll have both Tony and Jana Mendez here to talk to you about a escapade that took place in the 1970s in Iran. Not that one. Go watch Argo, right? Tony Mendez famously was played by Ben Affleck in the movie Argo, Academy Award-winning movie Argo. You get to see him next week. Now, his wife, John, is no slouch. She was chief of disguise for CIA before she retired. So the two of them will talk to you through a famous rescue that's not as well known, an exfiltration of a top CIA source that happens right before what you see in the movie Argo. It was a source that we wanted to make sure didn't get caught up in the Iranian Revolution. They wanted to get out, and Tony led that mission. He'll tell you all about it. The week after, actually, we have a very interesting speaker, Dan Mulvaney, who is a former Royal Canadian Mounted Police counter-espionage specialist. And he was actually very close to a KGB officer named Oleg Gordievsky, who was what we call an agent in place. We recruited Gordievsky to be a spy for us, but we didn't pull him out. We left him there. The Russians got wind somehow that he was a spy for us, and the race was on to get him out before he was arrested by the Soviets, which would have gone very, very badly for him. And so Dan was involved with that, and he'll be able to talk you through that as well. And then finally, on October 18th, Malcolm Nance, a close friend of ours here at the Spy Museum. He's a board member. You may see him on MSNBC if you watch that. He is a career counterterrorism and counterintelligence officer. He's also an expert at what we call SEER, which is survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. There's schools all around the military to pilots and special operations forces how to get out of bad situations fast if they find themselves in them, and or if they are captured, how to resist interrogation, how to resist torture. He'll be talking a little bit about that, his own close calls that he's had throughout his career, and some of the latest technology and techniques in things like arm recovery and hostage rescue, some stuff from the front lines. But today, we're joined by my friend Greg Elder, who is the chief historian for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Prior to that, he spent a career as an intelligence analyst for DIA and was recognized twice by the Director of National Intelligence for his analysis in military operations. He has degrees from, well, everywhere, so I won't list them all. Suffice it to say, he's a learned man. I don't know how you had time to do anything else other than go to school for master's degrees and everything else. There's plenty of stories he could tell, and he actually has told a lot of them. We've linked up together for 2 different podcasts because CIA has been significantly involved in many great escapes and rescues over the years. But I think the ones he's going to talk about today really resonates, at least with me, because I remember exactly where I was when it all went down. It was just a story that before the time when we're trying to juggle 500 different major front page stories in the press, it absolutely dominated everyone's conversation for several days. At the time, I didn't really actually know the extraordinary story that led to the rescue, but that's what Greg is here to tell us today. So please join me in welcoming Greg Elder. Thanks, Greg.
You know, in listening to Vince, it's interesting. I feel like, those of you who know the 3 tenors, like everybody always remembers the name of the first 2 tenors, but then they're always like, that third guy, who is it, right? And he's like naming Mendez and all these people, and then it's like, chief historian, Greg Elder, okay. But I hope to have a good discussion with you today, not just about the rescue of Jessica Lynch, PFC Jessica Lynch, but I'm going to go back a little bit in time to talk about some of the elements and important issues that lead to the rescue of Jessica Lynch, because the success that we have with the rescue of Jessica Lynch early on in the Iraq War doesn't come without literally decades of experience and background and lessons learned and failures along the way to be able to lead to such a successful operation. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time when I begin the discussion. But before I really begin any other part of this discussion, I also want to talk about one other thing here, which is that although we're going to be focusing on Jessica Lynch and the successful operation to rescue her in a hospital where we weren't sure whether, her medical condition, whether or not she was being beaten, tortured, so on, I want to bring this down a little level to remind people about the reality of the situation that we're generally talking about here. Although we're talking about Jessica Lynch, the person who got away, we're also going to talk a little bit about the 11 military members who died, right? Of Jessica Lynch's unit, when they were ambushed, 11 of our U.S. military members died, and an additional 7 were captured. And as a result of the Jessica Lynch rescue, what we often hear about is her and or getting her out and the special forces and the intelligence that went into it. One of the things that was able to come about as a result of that rescue operation as well was we were able to retrieve the bodies of those 11 service members. And that goes to our wider mission. And by we, I'm talking about me and the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Enterprise widely and a lot of other elements of the U.S. government, which is that we don't leave our people overseas. We don't leave them in uncovered or unmarked graves in other countries and so on. We do what we can to bring them out. And so actually bringing those 11 soldiers out is a bit of an important story in and of itself that comes with the Jessica Lynch story. So I wanted to mention that. Now let's go back in time a little bit and we'll go to Vietnam, because really we can't talk about Jessica Lynch without going back in time. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, our POW MIA mission, our ability to rescue, identify, acknowledge, understand, provide intelligence on where our prisoners of war were, was really a pretty shoddy effort. Generally, each of the intelligence elements within the services managed their own oversight of missing persons. There wasn't really a dedicated support unit to be able to do the broad range of different missions associated with POW MIA roles and responsibilities. When Vietnam started, the principal operations were Air Force related. A lot of aircraft were flying missions in Vietnam before we got our feet on the ground, and so it made sense that the Air Force was conducting the larger part of the POW MIA missions then. But as we put boots on the ground in Vietnam, it became apparent very early on that the Air Force didn't have the ability to manage such a large mission and to interact across the other services for something that obviously was a joint initiative, a joint effort. The fact that now we're talking about Marines on the ground and Army, they needed to be brought in as well. And so the issue was, how do you cross all these different organizations within the Department of Defense to make sure that our POWs and those missing in action are appropriately accounted for, that we're conducting intelligence operations so that we can make sure that they're okay, and then if possible, if a rescue operation attempt becomes feasible, that we can go out and actually conduct that. And so it was brought to DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, to kind of oversee and manage this mission from the Department of Defense's perspective. And throughout the war years, we developed a good deal of sources, produced thousands and thousands of individual reports on our POWs and MIAs, and had developed a firm understanding of what was happening in Vietnam with respect to our people over there. Well, in May of 1970, it came to light that there was a prisoner of war camp a little ways outside of Hanoi called Son Tay. And as the Air Force looking at some information and the Army looking at their own information acknowledged the fact that this was a camp with people in it, it was brought to DIA's attention. And so DIA, in working with the services, and here's a key point of this discussion that I want to bring up as well. Even though I'm going to talk a lot about my own agency today, Defense Intelligence Agency, I cannot say enough about the requisite of having so many different elements of the U.S. government be able to work together to do these things, right? So DIA does not do generally things by itself and just be able to go out and we're not talking Ian Fleming here, where DIA has our 007 guy who's able to just covertly go into Vietnam, find the Son Tay camp with a woman on his arm, show up to the camp, and with deadly precision, without even aiming his pistol, kill 27 North Vietnamese troops and get all of our POWs out, right? This is a very complex type of work that's required here, that requires from the initial inception of intelligence, the basic first pieces of information, all the way to actually the helicopters and aircraft landing on our own facilities, and medical folks getting them off and making sure our people are okay. So there's a broad range of issues here. DIA has provided this information on this camp called Son Tay, and we start working with the other organizations, and it becomes clear fairly early on that this is a major camp. We're able to identify 61 specific individuals within the camp. We know its location, and we start conducting really in-depth analysis about the level of North Vietnamese troop movements and efforts around the camp, what type of security that it has, the ingress and egress routes to the camp, all the way down to the fact, little things like there's 2 radars near the camp for air recovery, and there's a small gap between them. And we were able to identify this very tiny gap that you could fly between the radar coverage to ensure that we wouldn't be detected if we were ever to conduct an operation there. Well, eventually leadership says, listen, we have an opportunity here, and we would be really remiss if we didn't try to take an opportunity, given the fact that we know that our POWs are in such hard shape there. We have an opportunity to actually go conduct an operation. And so it was determined that we would conduct a major large-scale operation using special forces to go in, conduct a raid on this camp, and get our guys out of there. Right? Several months later, it's early November, our team deploys over there, special forces from multiple different elements, the Air Force providing a lot of assets to be able to fly our guys in, the Navy conducting a very large-scale deception campaign to draw Vietnamese forces away. Everything goes swimmingly well. The helicopters land, and although they initially go to a point a couple hundred yards away from the camp, they eventually really quickly make it to the camp. They bust inside. They've inflicted casualties on the enemy, but we've accepted no casualties ourselves. The intelligence and everything that goes into this seems absolutely perfect, and they break in the doors there, and they find there's not a single POW in the camp, right? Not a single POW in the camp. Conducted the operation, everything went perfect, and so in 1988, all of the senior operators, all the senior commanders of this task force who participated did a roundtable. And they're going around, they're saying, well, what are our lessons learned? What can we take away from the fact that we walked away without a single one of our POWs? And the issue comes up, well, it was an intelligence failure. Clearly an intelligence failure. We got on the ground, and the guys weren't there. That's an intelligence failure. And, it's interesting what the commander said. They said, actually, the operational intelligence was the best we've ever seen. Everything went precisely according to plan, right? We knew every single anti-aircraft battery. We knew where every single unit was. We knew where all the security was. It was picture perfect operation. And yet, when we landed, we weren't there. It was an operational intelligence success that ultimately led to a failed operation. And so, what do we learn from this? What do we take away from this type of operation? Why do I bring that up? Obviously, when I'm talking about Jessica Lynch. This is 1970. The thing is, those who don't learn from their mistakes are bound to repeat them over and over and over again. And we actually take some really big lessons from Son Tay. The first is that luck goes to those who are prepared, right? We were prepared for this operation in many ways. All of sophisticated, such a dangerous operation. It was kidded around for people who were involved in this. Some of them said they needed more information. There were a lot of people who said, I need to be involved in this operation. And ultimately, they were turned down over and over again. And security on this operation was so strict, they took it out of the Pentagon and put it in our Arlington Hall headquarters at the Defense Intelligence Agency and really restricted almost anybody from seeing it. Everybody involved in this was so upset about this, they created their own patch, right? It has a mushroom on it. Actually, there's mushrooms and an eye. And the lettering on this says KITD FOHS. And what this means is kept in the dark, fed only, horse pucky, except not pucky, right? Try and keep this PG for the kids out there. Kept in the dark, fed only, horse pucky, right? Because of the level of security around this operation. They were so frustrated about this, everybody got to wear a patch afterwards. So we learned about operational security on missions like this. The need to understand the facility itself, right? You're going to go conduct an operation like this. You had better have ground truth about the actual facility itself. And so one of the things that we did, we flew SR-71s, numerous SR-71 missions over this camp at very high altitudes. We also had AQM-34 Buffalo Hunter drones. We're actually going to have one in our museum. It's like an aircraft. In fact, one of our POWs in Sainte, Brigadier General John Reynolds, is noted as having said when we flew one of these Buffalo Hunter missions over, he thought it was the latest MiG. He was an Air Force pilot, and he was like, wow, look at that new MiG flying over. We were flying low-altitude drone flights over the camp as well, which gave us a precise footprint of the camp, every part of the camp. And we drew up these perfect maps that literally within a foot said where every building was, where the concertina wire was, where the fish pond was, right? Everything, down to the minutest detail. And then what we did, so the DIA analyst who worked on this part, taking all the photographic analysis, interpreting it, right, and coming up with blueprints, we then went to the CIA. They had a model maker. Now, this is the days before being able to just simply do a 3D printing model. Right now, you do a few 3D layouts, you click print, and 3 hours later, you walk back, right? Hollywood movie stuff. Lo and behold, there's this beautiful actual model. At this time, this took significant effort. This model was built over the course of several weeks. Our analyst sitting there with the model builder, building this literally perfect model of the facility, of the Sainte prison camp. You can see this now at the U.S. National Air Force Museum at Wright-Patt Air Force Base. And if you turn your head at certain angles and you look at this, it is precise. It is absolutely precise. When the Special Forces guys who were involved in the operation went down to Florida to start practicing and training, they had that located there. Such was the security of this model that it was guarded 24 hours a day. Every day it was guarded. But it gave people the ability to go over and to be able to look at it. The commanders and the operation, the helicopter pilots, everybody knew precisely where they were supposed to go, every building and the location where the walls were. This is a predecessor to, for instance, the UBL takedown in Pakistan, using the same type of model, that same type of precision to be able to make sure that the guys who go in on the ground felt comfortable that they were going to be okay. We came up with a confidence level of 95% that our folks would be able to land on the ground and not take casualties, 95%. We knew the building. So we learned a lot from this. You know what went wrong? You know what we didn't have right? The ultimate strategic objective of this was to ensure that we got our guys out. And before the operation, we had started seeing less and less intelligence indicating that there was actually guys on the ground there, right? It started diminishing. Now, we tried to find, we inserted a human collector, a spy. That doesn't work out real well to just insert somebody into North Vietnam and have them go to this area. They went to the area and they weren't able to get close enough or actually be able to collect the intelligence. So our human footprint was not able to provide the intelligence, which limited us to overhead imagery. We couldn't fly too many drone flights over the facility because we were afraid that the North Vietnamese would start to get an idea of what was happening, right? If you see an AQM-34 Buffalo Hunter, which is a very loud, low-altitude drone, right? It's not like one of our silent little prop jobs now where you're never going to know it's there. This is a loud, very large aircraft-type drone. And you see that thing flying every single day over Son Tay, of all places, you might start to develop an idea that maybe something's going to happen there. So we were concerned about that. And in the SR-71 flyovers were generally more high altitude, right? You're not able to get as much of the fidelity. And so we went a while without any intelligence actually validating the fact that there were people there or not, and we started getting concerned. But nevertheless, we didn't see anything that said that they weren't there either. There was something happening there. It's just that the indicators that we had been led to believe before suggested that that our POWs were there started diminishing. 2 days before the raid, our guys are on the ground, they're in Thailand, they're about ready to conduct the operation. DIA has intelligence officers there providing the latest intelligence on everything that's going on. Suddenly, one of the pieces that comes in, not from my agency, but one of the pieces of intelligence that comes in from a source within North Vietnam said that the POWs had been moved. This was right before takeoff, just shortly before takeoff of the aircraft. And now, leadership across the government, the Secretary of Defense, General Bennett, our director at the time, are really stuck with a quandary. Do we go in or not? We have one piece of intelligence that essentially says they're not there, and we have some indicators that suggest that the footprint that was there before isn't there anymore. Your confidence level drops significantly, but the guys are already on the ground. You cannot wait because it will jeopardize the mission. So you can't wait. So ultimately, it went to the Secretary of Defense. They had the discussion about the fact that there was a 95% chance, roughly, of guys being able to get there successfully conducting the operation and getting out. They took it to the President, President Nixon, and ultimately Nixon said, we can't afford not to do this. The Secretary of Defense's perspective was essentially, shame on us if we come to find out a month or two from now that our POWs were there, being treated like they were, and that we had the opportunity to do something and we didn't, right? So we conducted the operation, and like I said, ultimately the guys kick in the door and nothing's there. It goes to one of the very difficult things that we have when talking about rescue missions and POWs. One of the things is they get moved around. They moved around a lot. Jessica Buchanan, who's another person, I'm not going to tell her story much here, but an aid worker in Somalia, who we ultimately went to the government with special forces and with DI intelligence, went out and was successfully rescued in Somalia. They moved her almost every day, right? One of the things in the Jessica Lynch story was those 7 other missing, right? So there's Jessica Lynch, but there's those 7 other missing soldiers. And they said, well, why didn't the U.S. government go get those guys? Why didn't they rescue, there's a couple of women there, several men. Why didn't we rescue them? Turns out after the fact, those 7 people who we rescued said that they had been moved no fewer than 7 times in the 3 weeks between the time that they were captured and the time that we ultimately rescued them. That's extremely difficult to get, that level of information, that level of fidelity. At one point in time, in fact, we were so lost about where they were that we actually started fire missions, artillery fire missions, on targets very near to them. And when asked after the event, you know, hey, were you scared? I mean, obviously you're a POW, you're in Iraqi hands, you've been beaten up, several of them are wounded. The guys pointing machine guns at their head. My initial reaction would be, without even having artillery drop near me, yeah, I'm pretty scared, right? But we had artillery dropping right around them, and they were terrified. We don't always know where the people are, and we don't always know because they're often being moved. We also don't know sometimes because the intelligence that we get is bad. Let's just face it, not all of our sources are great. We have people who want to get paid money. We have people who want to provide disinformation. And a lot of the intelligence that we get is not always good. Going back to our Vietnam, after the Vietnam War, we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missing soldiers. And what we would do is we would get suddenly a piece of intel that came up that said, hey, in Laos, I saw 2 Caucasian tall guys in the jungle near this location. How do you act on that, right? 2 Caucasian guys in the jungle. Are they POWs? Are they missing guys? Or are they just 2 guys who got lost? I don't know. Or is it not even real? And all of that stuff mounts up and builds, and it becomes extremely difficult without very good intelligence to be able to make that distinction between the good that you should be doing in an operation or whether you're going to do more damage than good by going after bad information. Bad information. So let me talk about that. At the very beginning of the Gulf War in 1991, we had a Navy captain, Scott Spiker, Captain Scott Spiker of the United States Navy, on one of the very first missions over Iraq, and he was shot down. First person shot down. George Bush came out, George Bush 1, not George Bush 2, came out on television and said, we've had our first casualty. We've had our first person get shot down. We immediately, DIA immediately, of course, went to work on developing the package and working with our other services and intelligence organizations to be able to identify where he was. We started doing overhead imagery. We started considering whether or not, we could get people there to look. It looked like we found the plane. We also found, through imagery, we were able to find, with aircraft flying over, we found where his seat was. He launched out of the aircraft, but we couldn't find information that suggested that he lived or died. So we kept it open. We called him missing in action, right? As the war went on, we started getting little pieces of information here and there that suggested that he was alive. In fact, to the point that Saddam Hussein was regularly looking into and checking on him and wanted him alive because it's a bargaining piece, that you could use Scott Spiker as a bargaining chip in negotiations. And that was something that we got information on even well after the war, that he was alive out there. But we had nothing to actually validate his status, so we kept it open. Shortly before 2003, even before 2001, the attacks, we started getting information to suggest that he had in fact died. So we looked to close the case. 2002, before we went into Iraq, we started as concerns of Iraq started increasing and our intelligence collection increased in Iraq. We got information, again, raising doubt about whether or not Captain Spiker was alive. Now here again, we're getting these individual reports, and none of them are actual validated confirmation. We went in with a UN mission and actually went to the location of the crashed plane and couldn't find Captain Spiker. We couldn't find his body. So that only raises questions, right? Is he alive? Did they actually take him? Certainly if you don't find his body, the door is open to the fact that Captain Spiker is alive. On the other hand, the fact that you don't find the body there doesn't mean that somebody didn't take and bury him or that he didn't die in a prison somewhere. We just don't know. Well, 2003, we invaded Iraq, and we started getting more and more intelligence. In fact, and Captain Spiker's as an intelligence requirement, here's the significance that we place on finding our POWs and missing in action. When we captured Saddam Hussein, the number 2 question Saddam Hussein was asked was, where's Captain Spiker? Now, let that sink in for a minute. The second question that one of the biggest dictators in history was asked when he was captured was, where's Captain Spiker? And he goes, who's Captain Spiker, right? But another piece of intelligence comes up. Piece of intelligence looks like a beam to me, right? This is a beam from an Iraqi prison. On the beam, in ink, is MSS, the initials of Michael Scott Spiker, in a prison. Good information? Bad information? It certainly was enough that we raised the case again and really went to ground trying to find out what happened to him. Spent considerable resources in Iraq trying to find our lost soldier, because as pieces of information like this come up on our people, we have to have due diligence and at least try. But a lot of information that we get isn't good. Came to find out there's all sorts of other initials there. Now, that could be from prisoners, but what we actually believe is that these were just other people in there who just happened to put their initials down, and that one of them just happened to be MSS. A lot of Islamic Arabic names start with M, starting with, let's call it Muhammad, right? We don't know. But nevertheless, we did not give up on Captain Spiker, and it is part of our mission to make sure that we never allow a missing persons folder or file to simply go by the wayside. We always continue to put due diligence into trying to find our people. In 2009, we got a tip from an Iraqi who provided intelligence to U.S. military forces that he had heard roughly that some Bedouins in the area had buried Captain Spiker out in the desert after he crashed. So we sent in a unit of Marines to actually go do an excavation, and we found the remains of Captain Spiker in 2009. We found his jawbone, and we were able to, through DNA analysis, be able to validate that it was actually him. This all goes to the rescue and operations discussion that we're having here today, though, because I want to stress the difficulties in this type of a mission. The fact that we dedicated so many resources to him, right, is on the one hand very good because we're not going to give up our people. On the other hand, it demonstrates the fact that even as information is coming in, if it's not actionable, if it's not something that we can actually substantiate, it makes it very, very difficult to actually do something with. Now, this is some of the sand that we recovered from the actual crash site. The Defense Intelligence Agency is building a museum right now, and we will be having a tribute to Captain Spiker in that museum, a brave American. But I raise that again because lessons learned and the difficulties that come with something, so that now when I can talk to you about what happens with Jessica Lynch, we get to the complexity of the situation. So Jessica Lynch, she's part of the 507th Maintenance Group in Iraq. This is an element of the U.S. military that is overseeing a Patriot battery, the logistics and maintenance crew of a Patriot battery. It's a very large group of vehicles that are required for this with a lot of people. 34 vehicles, very large. These are not small vehicles. They were embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division in the initial attack in Iraq, and what they were supposed to do was go toward Nasiriyah, and then they were going to move north as part of the attack against Baghdad, taking Baghdad. Because of the fact that they were logistics and maintenance, they were at the very back end of the column of hundreds of vehicles that supported the 3rd Infantry Division. They got the luck of the draw that they weren't just near the back, they were the very back. They were the tail end of the entire 3rd Infantry Division's movement from Kuwait into Iraq. Well, some of these vehicles are extremely large. We're talking flatbed trucks carrying very heavy loads of equipment. And very early on, as the 3rd ID advanced forward, of course, the idea here is that although we plan to move very rapidly, you can't always guarantee that you're going to move as rapidly as you hope. Well, it turns out we invaded Iraq, we moved very rapidly. The level of combat that we expected was not nearly as much in reality as again, that we had anticipated. Our forces just rolled through. And as they moved forward very rapidly, the 507th started struggling with the maneuvers in Iraq because of the road and infrastructure. A lot of them kept getting stuck in the sand. Every few minutes, another vehicle would get stuck. And so they slowed down and slowed down and slowed down. And this entire time, the 3rd ID is moving forward very rapidly, and the 507th becomes more and more divorced from the rest of the 3rd ID. So much so that when they're supposed to make the turn at Nasiriyah, the guys who are supposed to be there essentially guiding traffic, right? Like traffic cops who are sitting there supposed to be telling our U.S. forces, don't take a left at Albuquerque, right? You can't, you've got to make the right, not the left. That person's not there. So they start to get a little lost, and they take a very, very wrong turn. At one point in time, they even drive by an Iraqi guard. Now, we're in the middle, the war is going on right now, and here's an Iraqi guard in uniform, and he waves and passes them through. Hey, guys. Hey, Americans. I don't know if I was that Iraqi guard, I would feel terribly comfortably about firing on an entire column of U.S. forces, but anyway, he waves them through. Instead of going around al-Nasiriyah, as the plan was, they took a wrong turn, and they ended up driving into al-Nasiriyah, into the town itself. They actually go through a large part of al-Nasiriyah before they realize, we did make a wrong turn at Albuquerque, right? They get well into the town before they realize this, and they make the determination that the best thing that they can do is probably turn around and go back. Al-Nasiriyah hasn't been captured. It is being held by the Iraqis. The Iraqis have tanks there. They have large Fedayeen units, and I'll talk about the Fedayeen here in a minute. The city is an occupied, Iraqi city. It's guarded by Iraqi regular and irregular military forces. So as they turn around and they start driving back through al-Nasiriyah, they start taking fire, not surprisingly. Right? People have been alerted about the fact that a major U.S. column that's virtually unprotected has just driven through the city. It gets people out. So as they drive back, they start taking heavy fire. And they start breaking into 3 separate columns because of the speed variance in the vehicles, right? That Humvee up front is going to be able to move a lot faster with a couple of very small trucks loaded with equipment than that 18-wheeler carrying, several thousand pounds of heavy equipment. And they get broken up. The first unit makes it all the way back unscathed. Although rounds start getting fired at them, they make it back unscathed. They get to a Marine unit and they say, hey, listen, we've been broken into several different pieces. The other 2 elements of our column are getting shot up. Can you go support them? And the Marines say, well, absolutely, right? There's gas issues, right? Tanks take a lot of gas. So there's some delays in that. There's communications issues. For instance, GPS. With the GPS that we were using at that time was not effective. It gave you essentially just like a big grid area that you were in. The communications in terms of the actual like walkie-talkies and so on weren't very effective, and communications were very poor. So as these units get dispersed and as the Marines start going back to try to find where they are, some of the communications and issues begin to fall apart. The second unit that's going through, they start taking much heavier fire. They take a number of casualties. A couple of the vehicles actually stop. The rest of the unit moves forward. They make it out safely. Half does, half doesn't. But the third unit, it's the third unit of the 507th that we find Jessica Lynch, 19-year-old private first class Jessica Lynch. She's part of a group, obviously, who's been trained in logistics. They've never seen combat before. They have been basically trained. They have basic training. After the fact, they will go, the U.S. military will look at the weapons that several of these soldiers have. They'll go back and look at the training that they've been afforded. The weapons had sand in them. They were jamming. They hadn't been cleaned regularly. These were soldiers who were not designed or prepared to be in the situation where they were at, actually behind enemy lines. When the Marines first heard that this logistics unit had been trapped behind or caught behind enemy lines in an ambush, everybody said, well, that can't be. A logistics unit is supposed to be well behind where the actual combat operations are taking place. Of course, that wasn't the case. So you have this unit of several vehicles, with Jessica Lynch being one of them, of people who have not been in combat before, suddenly thrown in the midst of what then very quickly became an ambush. The Iraqis really came out in force and started leveling large quantities of fire. There are actually tanks involved as well against our forces there. We're going to get 2 Silver Stars and 1 Bronze Star with a V for combat operational support, as the couple of soldiers who are actually able to get engaged in the firefight, whose weapons haven't jammed, inflict significant casualties to the degree that they can on Iraqi forces fighting them. But while all this is going on, the vehicle that Jessica Lynch is in goes out of control. They're wounded in it and slams into the back of a truck. She's out of it, right? So there's things that come out afterwards that say that she fought to the last minute, she expended all of her rounds. She's the very first person, and very honestly, at that, to come out and say that she never fired a shot. In fact, when she hit the back of that vehicle, essentially she lost all consciousness, and for 3 hours she lost track of time about what was happening. But this major firefight is going down around her, and we're taking casualties, many wounded. Like I said, 11 killed in action during this attack. Among the individuals who were fighting against her, well, we'll see if you can guess who this is. Right. Okay. See if you can guess. Darth Vader with not Darth Vader with stormtroopers, but Fedayeen. So our Fedayeen in Iraq were irregular soldiers who had committed themselves to fighting for Saddam Hussein. Since the 1990s, Saddam Hussein understood that he had to have security in towns and cities all around Iraq. His Ba'athist party was a minority party. There's a large Shia, population in Iraq. The Ba'ath and he are Sunnis to the degree that they practice religion, and he had to keep the ethnic minorities and oppositionists down. And to have a police force be able to do that is extremely difficult. So he commissioned thousands of volunteers who wore helmets like these to look scary. They wore black uniforms, and he could rely on them to help quell any uprising or so on that happened. When the war began, though, these individuals are called on to become part of irregular operations against U.S. forces. And as our forces in al-Nasiriyah get caught behind enemy lines, it's not just regular forces that go out to fight them, it's the Fedayeen as well. We have a brand new helmet. It's essentially brand new. I brought this one, though, for those of you who want to come up and look at this afterwards. You will find this is not a very effective helmet. This is a psychological deterrent. This is to look scary. I was talking to Vince before we came here. During World War II, the British used to train their soldiers with pellet guns so that they didn't expend too much ammunition. And I have at home this really high velocity pellet gun, and I use these kind of composite pellets. I could put a pellet through this helmet, right? You wouldn't want to be shot at by anything more than a BB with this, but the psychological deterrent had its effect against people in the population. But then the Fedayeen came out and were wearing, in many cases, these uniforms when they went out and fought our soldiers. Incidentally, when our Marines get into al-Nasiriyah, they find piles of these helmets and the black uniforms that the Fedayeen wear, because the Iraqis learned very quickly that wearing this helmet identified you as a bad guy and was not very career enhancing. So our forces are going through a really terrible time. The Marines may make it to the second group. They're able to save a number of guys, but by the time our forces make it to the third unit that's been broken up with PFC Jessica Lynch, by that time it's too late. They've taken her, they've taken the killed, they've taken the captured. That day, in fact, the live prisoners who are conscious and awake are videotaped and put on Al Jazeera television for the world to see that they had captured our soldiers. So, I mean, look, but it's disgusting in a way, parading our soldiers around. From our perspective and from an intelligence perspective, though, I have to say that's proof of life for us. So that at least lets us know the status of several of our soldiers. Now, of course, they only showed the ones who were alive, and that raises all sorts of questions about, well, why wasn't Private Timothy shown? Why wasn't she shown? So it opens doors both ways again, like with Spiker, but at least that proof of life demonstrated that several of the soldiers were alive. But we lost all track of them. Like I said, these soldiers were moved around, and what we only found out much later was that the killed soldiers had been moved to the Saddam Hussein hospital in al-Nasiriyah. They moved Jessica Lynch at first to a little local hospital, and they realized that her wounds were so extensive. And if I'm asked later about the stories about how her wounds were inflicted, whether or not she was beaten or whether other things happened to her. The fact of the matter is I just don't know. There was a 3-hour period of time where she was unconscious, where she was separated from her forces, and where there's a lot of questions about what happened to her in that interim period. I won't speak for that. I simply don't know. But she's taken to one hospital. They immediately try to work on her. The extensiveness of her wounds, which include a broken arm, broken thigh, dislocated ankle, severe lacerations on her head and other places on her body, are so severe that they can't take care of her there. So they move her to the Saddam Hussein Hospital a little further away, and they immediately go to work on her. And to the great appreciation to the Iraqis in this hospital, they took very good care of her. They immediately did everything that they could to make sure that she was healthy and okay. But that's where she is. That's where Jessica Lynch is, and that's where she will be for a period of time. She's segregated from the rest of the wards. Most people don't know that she's there except for a few doctors. Incidentally, the Ba'athist Party headquarters are located in the basement of this hospital, clearly against military and diplomatic laws, right? You're not supposed to put military and diplomatic and government headquarters in places like hospitals. But as had happened many times with the Iraqis, they were trying to protect key government and military sites by putting innocent people in front of them. So the Ba'athist Party headquarters were in there. There were some people who knew that she was there, but they isolated her. So finding her becomes very difficult. We don't know where the rest of the wounded are. We don't know where they've been taken. We don't know at this period of time where Jessica Lynch is, and several days go before we are able to determine. By going to the initial hospital, we find some of her clothing. And we're able to identify that at least she lived till she was there. There were blood stains on all of it, but they found that she had been at this initial hospital and then moved. Okay, so that puts her in the same situation as our other missing in action. We didn't know where she was. As we move forward in the story, we start dedicating significant levels of effort to trying to find out information about her. And it is through the development of human sources, spies, in the area, locals who are averse to Saddam Hussein, who are sympathetic to the U.S., or just for money reasons, begin to provide information on what is happening. And we start to get people who provide tips about the status of our POWs, and one of them is Jessica Lynch. An individual who's a lawyer, now getting to sources here, an individual who's a lawyer, an Iraqi lawyer, shows up at a Marine forward operating base and says, Jessica Lynch is alive. She's at the Saddam Hussein hospital, she's at the second floor, and my wife works at the hospital as a nurse, and so I know that she's there. His wife's not a nurse. We find that out later. She's not a nurse, and he just happened to be there for other reasons. But nevertheless, he shows up there with this type of precise information. That enables us to start looking for intelligence, other sources of intelligence on what's happening. And we also begin the process through what's called a National Intelligence Support Team. DIA leads this National Intelligence Support Team. A National Intelligence Support Team, or NIST, is an element that's created in a combat area that is the footprint or intermediary between combat operations on the ground and Washington, D.C. Because you can imagine, with all of the different intelligence organizations and bureaucracies and size that we have here, and you're some guy on the ground out forward, actually in combat operations, and you need to know about what the adversary is doing or some strategic level or operational intelligence, right? Who do you call? You're more likely to find Ghostbusters than that one analyst who happens to be the resident expert on a certain type of RPG that you need to know about, right? So National Intelligence Support Team is created to act as the facilitating element between combat operations out forward and Washington, D.C. And what that enables us to do is to start getting those requirements about the hospital, about Jessica Lynch, about her unit and so on, passed back to be able to start doing far more collection. Now I mentioned with Sonte, and so again we get to the lessons of the past and what we get from that. What about the hospital, right? Is it active? We find that out, yes, it's an active hospital. So now, if Jessica Lynch is there and we're going to conduct an operation, that's pretty significant. You don't just go into a hospital, a live hospital, with injured people in a combat role, where there perhaps are many combat enemy soldiers there. Maybe it's surrounded by artillery. Maybe they have anti-aircraft. We don't know, right? So we have to start getting the truth about the hospital. What is the status of the hospital? Is it a military unit? What is the status of the hospital in terms of ingress and egress routes? Are there better ways to come at the hospital than other ways? And then the bigger part of it, which we learned from Sante, is none of this matters if your person isn't there, right? So imagine again, we go through all this work, and today I'm standing here and I say, we did everything right. So, we had the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, a SEAL team, a joint task force with Green Berets, U.S. Air Force Pararescue, Rangers, and Delta Forces, all participate in this operation, and they got there, and guess what? She wasn't there, right? One of the key things we had to clearly identify and be able to speak to as the ball started rolling in terms of whether or not we're actually going to go try and do something is Jessica Lynch there? So multiple balls start rolling, multiple things start going on to be able to start saying she's a U.S. military member, she's potentially in very, very bad danger, she's clearly injured, and we need to get her. Is she there? And what do we need to do to be able to get her out? What you will read about if you go into this is that we had one intelligence source, this lawyer, who was in the hospital and knew where she was. We had a second source. So we were able to rely on 2 sympathizers who were able to go into the hospital and actually be able to validate where she was and that she was alive. Take a look around the room real quick. No, I'm being facetious. Like, I'm not kidding around. Take a look around the room real quick. You're being recorded, right? 2 cameras. Suppose I tell you that I'm recording every single one of you right now. We're waving back. In order to validate proof of life, we had to have somebody go in and actually videotape the fact that she was alive. We had gotten so much false information and bad information on POWs in the past that we could not risk a major operation, especially with the potential political blowback of conducting an operation against an active hospital, only to find out that she wasn't there. So DIA, who in this process, by the way, just to pat ourselves on the back for a second, a lot of elements involved in this. We have a POW MIA cell whose entire job is to do support for getting our POWs and MIAs, keeping track of them, and if at all possible, rescuing them. We have facilities people whose job it was to specifically do things like look at that hospital. By the way, the reason why we're so precise, like I know that people think that a lot of innocent people die in war today, but I will tell you that if we had a major target in World War II that we needed to conduct an attack against, what we would do is we would line up about 250 B-17s. We would clear out a block, about maybe 10 square miles of space, and we would just carpet bomb it, right? We're very successful nowadays at being able to be far more precise, obviously, in targeting. It's not always perfect, but one of the reasons that we're so successful today in limiting the number of casualties is that we have people who spend their entire lives doing nothing but discriminating between, is that a hospital or is that a military target? Is that a person's house or is that a training facility for the military? So we have people whose job it is to do things like look at military facilities or look at, when something like this comes up, a hospital. We have medical intelligence support folks who are looking at situations like this as well. A hospital gets brought up, okay, what about this hospital? Attaché and diplomatic efforts to try and obtain information. that might help us find out the status of our POWs and MIAs. People who are collecting intelligence support people. And then the NIST I already mentioned, and we had at the course of the beginning of the war, something like 1,000 people forward deployed to be able to provide immediate support to combat operations at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. So we have all of this going on. Well, so we find out about Jessica Lynch and we say, hey, to the source, are you willing to go in and wear a wire? Right? So we always see that in the movie, and it's never a fun thing. Nobody wants to be the guy who wears a wire. But we say, you'll never be noticed. Nobody will ever know when you walk into that hospital that you're anything other than just a regular Iraqi citizen. One of the guys we fly in to the forward operating base near the hospital is a guy, I'm not going to provide his name, but we will call him Gunnery Gadget for his nickname here. He is a gadget guy. His entire job, his entire life goal is to build really cool stuff, right? Stuff that you see downstairs, stuff that James Bond type stuff sees. It is the real Ian Fleming, where the majority of Ian Fleming is not real. There is the real Ian Fleming out there of people whose job it is to support operations like this. He flies in, and lo and behold, we have our bag. There's a little hole right there. It looks like most bags, most gym bags, have little holes in them to let the air out, and everything has a little round metal thing around it to make sure that the fabric doesn't rip. And when we look inside, we find the cables that have intentionally been brought out so that you can see it, but a little camera is in here. Our source walks all around the hospital. He's able to go exactly to her room. He stops by, he points the camera at her, and from that we're able to identify the fact that she's alive, the fact that she's injured, but it looks like she's stabilized. The ingress and egress routes to the hospital. We're able to find that there are not large military elements in the hospital. There's no real security, which enables us to start planning an operation in such a way that we think that we can do it without inflicting combat casualties or risking the lives of the innocent people in the hospital, because that, to save one of our military people, if we had gone in and killed 40 or 50 innocent Iraqis in the meantime, would not have been acceptable. So through the use of this source, we were able to identify all the key information that we needed from the outside, or from the inside of the hospital. Now from the outside, we were able to get blueprints of the hospital that help us see, again, ingress, egress routes, what floors people are on, the surrounding infrastructure and support for the building. Intelligence is collected on the outside of the building. There are actually tanks fairly nearby. There are military units nearby. The building adjacent to the hospital is has a Fedayeen unit in it. So now, although the hospital itself is not very secure on the inside, we don't have to worry about what's going to happen when we go inside to get her. Nevertheless, from the outside, there are significant forces that we have to be concerned about. So now we have to take that into consideration and balance out exactly how we're going to conduct this mission. Lessons learned from Son Tay. Going back in time. How do you get those Iraqis outside to be focused on something else? How do you get them not looking at what you don't want them to see happening behind them, have them looking out forward? Well, a major effort was done to get them to look the wrong direction. We conducted a major operation just across the river from the hospital. And this was conducted by the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Marines, the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Marines, and a SEAL team, all staged and conducted very active live fire engagements near the hospital, but a few blocks away, to be able to draw the fire and draw in all of the enemy forces operating around the hospital to make sure that when we actually conducted the operation at 1 o'clock in the morning against the hospital to make sure that she was okay, that all went well. It was such a successful diversion that the helicopters flying to the hospital ultimately had to stage behind for a while because the live firing was so intense that rounds were going up into the air and actually placed the operation at risk. But from a success standpoint, what that really did, it really did draw the Iraqis away from the hospital so that the hospital itself was not under real military occupation. So at that point in time, our task force with the Green Berets, the U.S. Air Force, pararescue team, Rangers, and Delta Force are able to launch this night raid and go in. The video is online. Anybody can go watch it. It's a very harrowing event. There are significant awards given out to our combat members in support of this. Incidentally, there will be 488 military members who put their lives at risk for this operation. 488 military. So of course, that raises another question, right? We're going in to save Jessica Lynch, a single soldier. 488 people are putting their lives on the line to go save our soldier there, right? It has to be right. We have to break down intelligence barriers to be able to effectively share information. We have to be able to work with our military members succinctly, precisely, without any kinks in the road. We have to make sure that when those guys get on the ground, Jessica Lynch is actually going to be there, that they know where she's at, that they know every single part of what's happening in that operation. And we were able to do that. We were able to do that because of a lot of lessons learned. Again, the video is on YouTube or whatever. You can go get that. They land, they go in, and everything works precisely according to plan, except Jessica Lynch isn't there. I'm kidding. She was there. I'm kidding. No, really, she was there. Really, she was there. Really, she was there. You'll see her, and actually, it kind of makes me sick. There's some people when they get her, she's very twitchy and she's crying, and it's very hard on her. And I've seen people write about her, saying, "Well, this is women in combat. This is what we get." Now, this woman, again, had been through major operations, broken arm, broken thigh, dislocated ankle, had been in a major combat operation and had her vehicle crash into the back of another vehicle. She had been mishandled. She was under armed guard with a gun being pointed at her. There's a possibility that she was actually abused, right? Yeah, she was a little out of it when we got her. And I would trust her any day with my life, all right? So they get her out of there, and they bring her back, and the story ends successfully. The root of this story, the basis of all of this, coming back to the intelligence perspective, is really about the fact that the first and foremost part of this is there has to be vital intelligence to actually validate that the strategic end game, the goal, right, that the person you're going to save, the people you're going to save are there. And that requires a level of dedication, sophistication, and resources that I think a lot of people simply don't get. Why didn't we go after Hannah Hilton? Why didn't we go after a lot of other things in Vietnam? Why haven't we gone after every incident where there's an aid worker or somebody who's been captured? The bottom line is it's hard work. And it's not just hard work, it requires almost precise information. It's Jessica Lynch, right? Okay, I told you guys about her. She was an aid worker captured in Somalia, moved 7 times, right? The only reason that we were able as the U.S. government to go in and get them was that they did a proof of life video of her, and she suggested the fact that she was going to die soon from a health issue. So the issue really was then a matter of life and death. If we don't do something to go in and rescue her, then she's probably going to die. And we didn't have perfect intelligence. We were able to identify several locations that she might be at and essentially identify then from that which one we thought she was most likely to be at. And as a result of that, the Special Forces went in another successful operation and were able to get her. But that was a life and death situation, right? The level of precision required from an intelligence perspective to get these things right is not Ian Fleming with James Bond riding out with his pistol and the woman on his shoulder. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individuals across multiple organizations communicating and effectively working together to achieve a very specific objective and aim. With that, I'd like to open it up. I tried to leave some time here for questions. I'd like to open it up to some questions. Yes?
Yeah, I guess one big difference between the two operations is the fact that the Soviets weren't there. If I remember correctly, we had practiced on a mock-up that the Soviets overhead would have picked up on. And also there was that Navy spy that was talking to the Soviets, and the Soviets just passed it on to the Vietnamese. And also, do you know what happened to that incompetent company commander who crossed the river when he wasn't supposed to? Her company commander, did he ever get court-martialed?
All right, so there's a couple questions there. The first one being back in Son Tay and the fact that the Russians were providing some intelligence and so on. The myth that the Russians were doing overhead and found the model that was secured, that wasn't the case. That model was secured. The why they moved, for instance, our POWs from Son Tay, there's a lot of debate about that. One of them being that an American spy, a spy for the North Vietnamese here in the United States, provided them intelligence. It's not very good intelligence. I mean, it's not very valid. Some people say that they were moved because of the rain. The rainwater was getting so high it was flooding the camp, and that's why they moved them. In fact, Brigadier General John Reynolds, because he had, from a disciplinary perspective, he wasn't a very good prisoner of war. He didn't like to give information to the North Vietnamese, so they put him in a below ground where the water is. They put him in like a cistern, right? So anyway, what he says is, I can tell you definitively, because I was 20 feet below ground, that there wasn't flooding, because I would have been the first person to have known, like screaming and yelling for help, that I was going to drown. We don't know why they were moved, and we don't know, there's nothing to suggest that the Russians necessarily had any part in that. In terms of the captain who made the wrong turn in the Jessica Lynch incident, no soldiers were reprimanded. As a result of that, analysis was done by the Department of Defense, and they said there was a lot of reasons that went into that. Poor equipment, poor communications equipment, poor maps, fatigue, because these guys were so far behind and they had to try to catch up to the 3rd Infantry Division. They had literally been trying to move continuously for 3 straight days with almost no sleep. And so the wrong turn, they're not the first ones to do it. But certainly it was a very big mistake, and it obviously had very significant implications in terms of that operation. Yes?
You were going to tell us about the rescue of the 7 other people that were captured?
Yeah. I wasn't going to go into that too deep because it's a little more simple. So we had looked and looked and looked for these individuals, and again, we were unable to find them. But in another coincidence, another Iraqi sympathizer went and told some of the Marines that he knew where the rest of them were, and that again, it was a situation where there weren't very many security guards around. It was a very unsecure location. Most of the Iraqis were fleeing. And so a Marine unit went and was able to secure the safety of the other 7 and get them out. But that was 21 days. It took 21 days before they were able to get out. Some people have criticized, again, the government for not acting quicker on those. On that one, the bottom line is the second we got the intelligence from that sympathizer, we acted on it. So the issue was that they were moved 7 times in the interim, and it was, the Israelis trying to find Yasser Arafat. The guy slept in a different home every night. If the Israelis can't find Yasser Arafat, trying to find a few soldiers who are being continuously moved gives you a sense of just how difficult that type of operation is. Ma'am.
Hold on, please. Hold on, please, ma'am.
With this camera bag here, I go in and out of Israel a lot, and boy, do they search that. And last week at the castle at the Smithsonian, she went through, made me open every zipper. How come they didn't find the camera?
Well, the security never stopped him. He was just an ordinary Iraqi coming in and out. It's a hospital with a lot of people, so he was never stopped. Also, if you were to just necessarily look at that bag, especially with some stuff that was, you put some stuff in there to try and cover it up, it would be very difficult to see. X-ray, you could certainly, these types of things, they're not perfect, but it's very difficult to identify that camera. It's very difficult. But from a security standpoint, it didn't matter because he was never frisked. They never looked at his bag. Yep. Yes. Oh, okay.
I have a question back here.
Hi, two questions. One, in regard to the Sante raid, have you or one of your counterparts in the American intelligence bureaucracy made an attempt to find a historian on the Vietnamese side to find out what actually happened in regard to the movement of the POWs? That's question number one.
Okay.
And secondly, question number two is, with that raid receding into our distant memory, how does the intelligence community ensure that the corporate memory retains, what was the key mistake there, and going forward, that those lessons don't get lost? Thank you.
Actually, the second question is a lot harder than the first. So with respect to the first question, there was dialogue about Sonte, and it hasn't been recently, but in the years following the war, there was some interaction, and decades went by, and the problem is that the people who actually knew what happened, so say that they're questionable sources. So they say, well, they were moved because we knew exactly what you were going to do. Well, I mean, we know for a fact that simply isn't the case. If the Vietnamese had known that we were going to be there, trust me, we would not have landed, inflicted significant casualties on local North Vietnamese soldiers, and been able to get out virtually unscathed like we did. We would not have heard afterwards how embarrassed the North Vietnamese government was about the fact that the United States had been able to conduct such an operation there, and again, without effectively suffering any casualties. It was a very big success as far as the actual raid, the raid part of it goes. So we have not, there's a number of different theories. There's some information out there that goes one way or another, but I would say, having looked at this fairly substantially, there is not a very good explanation that actually has real substance and information behind it that I would say, yeah, that's the reason. So getting to the second part, well, the intelligence community, as well as the Department of Defense, mandates heritage programs and lessons learned programs as well. So there are the programs out there designed to do this. And there is a good deal of writing. Generally, almost after every type of operation, a major lessons learned is done. The harder part is incorporating it and getting people to effectively read it and utilize it, right? So there's a really good quote about the fact that we currently suffer from historic attention deficit disorder. Christopher Andrew over in Britain, the famous military and intelligence historian over there, came up with that. I would love to say that I did that. But we suffer from historic deficit attention disorder, which is to say that we're so busy looking at the now and the future that we often forget that sometimes looking in the rearview mirror is the right way to look too. That the thing that's coming up behind you to bite you can only be seen if you look in the past. And that, I would say, is the biggest challenge. I would like to see more written on lessons learned. I would like to see more on history written. But quite frankly, there's a lot written as it is. There is a good deal written. Again, the hardest part is getting people to not just when they go to the War College, because, for instance, when I went to the Naval War College, they have a class with 93 books in it, called like Strategy and Policy from Thucydides to Today. Fantastic course, right? I mean, literally fantastic course if you like to read history like me. If you don't, but a really, really great course. And you have these people going through the best books ever written about strategy and policy and intelligence and military operations. And then the thing is, how do you make sure that that person, when they graduate and they go back into the actual unit, keeps up on that type of understanding to say, okay, so this teaches me from the broad scale why history is important. Here's my mission now. What is out there now that I can look at, that I can draw on, that's going to help me do better in my mission today? And that, I think, is the challenge. That's the challenge. Yes. Oh, okay.
Just on a ballpark figure, how many of these gadget guys do we actually employ? Is it like dozens, hundreds, 1,000, or?
Somewhere between 1 and 1 million. I hope that narrows it. It's 56. No, I don't know. I don't know. But they're really cool guys.
Wait, we got her, and then we'll
Okay.
get to you. Sorry.
Did that gunnery gadget speak to her when he saw her? And how did they physically carry her out, like being that she was injured?
No, Gunner Gadget did his job, and that I know of never met her. I mean, he may have, but I don't know. I mean, his job was to essentially get everything ready to go. How did they get her out? Well, we have a fantastic U.S. Air Force pararescue capability, and these people are trained doctors. They're trained to be able to go conduct special operations with teams like SEAL and Delta to be able to go in and at a moment's notice get people who are injured in almost virtually any condition out, and what's more, to do so in very precarious and dangerous situations. And so they went in fully prepared, knowing basically what her injuries were. They had all the medical equipment and everything ready to go so that they could get her out to the helicopter and then get her rapidly to a medical facility. So they had all of the resources essentially available. And again, that's one of those things that good intelligence is able to provide, because you know when you get in there, you're going to need certain things, right? So it's not like, well, she's not wounded at all, so we can just go right in. No, we knew that we needed to have some paramedics there to be able to ensure that she was okay for transport, and then what the best way for transportation was to be able to transport her safely. Yep.
We got these.
Okay.
In Iraq, when the convoys got separated, when the one went right and the other one went into, what happened to the guy that was supposed to be there to tell them where to go?
Yeah,
What happened to him? Why wasn't
it's
he
a little
there?
outside of my wheelhouse, but I've read enough to be able. I mean, they were so far behind. It wasn't like a couple of hours. It wasn't like a day. They were so far behind. Now here gets to the communication issue, and you know, the DoD did write a fairly substantial, again, lessons learned on this in terms of communications. Pulling that guy wasn't necessarily the wrong thing. But if you're going to pull him, you better have at least gotten the communications to effectively know where the elements are that are coming from behind, that they know where they're supposed to turn, that they have the right maps, the right ability to do everything like that. And the bottom line is that essentially it doesn't look like all of the things that were supposed to happen there happened. And the GPS, which was supposed to be another avenue to be able to help support, wasn't sufficiently accurate to be able. And I'm sure nobody here has had any problems with like GPS or something where they say turn right here and 6 miles later you have absolutely no idea where you're at. A little more difficult even then. But you know, these are the type of things that the next time you go into combat, you certainly hope that lesson sticks, that you're able to tell folks the next time around. Hey, you're in logistics. Have your act together and know where you're going, right? You're part of the detail that's supposed to provide information to make sure everybody gets to where they're supposed to go, right? Do not ever leave your post until you actually have firm confirmation, either the person's there turning, looking at you, and you point and you go that way, or again that the information is there. But this is the importance of history and lessons learned, so that the next time around that we're in a situation like this, that there is somebody there at that post making sure that they're making the turn at the right location. Yeah.
I'm sure you said at the start, was this the first Iraq war or the second? And were there a lot of operators that we had on the ground with, like your black bag friend there?
So this is the second Iraq War. I mean, I talked about Captain Spiker. He was shot down in the first Gulf War in 1991, but the Jessica Lynch is in 2003 in the second Gulf War. I can't speak to whether there's a whole lot of other rescue operations or such like this. Only that, you know, there's good reason to be able to have that capability around, obviously, for such instances as this. History's replete, though, with examples of people who have used, you know, gadgetry like this to be able to conduct operations like that. Yes.
Where did they find and how did they recover the bodies of the 11?
Oh, that's a good question. I did mean to get to that. So as part of the individuals who were sympathizers in providing information, they let us know that they had seen some digging out there and that there was quite possibly bodies that were left there. As a result of that, when we conducted the operation, we ensured that we had a detail to be able to go out. There was, in fact, loose dirt. It was very clear that there had been digging there. Actually, long after Jessica Lynch had already been taken away, our folks dug there until after sunlight, in some cases putting themselves at real risk to be able to excavate and get our soldiers out of there, but that came from tips as well. Again, getting to the importance of having the local populace on your side to be able to provide that type of information and asking the right questions. Yes?
Do you know hold on.
Yes.
Do you know whatever happened to the Iraqi sympathizers?
Yes. He's in the United States today as a U.S. citizen. In fact, the town, and this, if I'm a little wrong on this detail, please forgive me, but my understanding in all my readings on all of this is that the town that Jessica Lynch came from, we not only worked to make sure that he could come back to the United States as a U.S. citizen because he put himself at risk as he did and was so effective in helping us, but that the people in West Virginia from the same town as Jessica Lynch put together a fund and helped to make sure that when he got here, he was in good shape. Yeah. Yep.
Did Captain Spiker die as a result of the shoot down once you found him, or did he survive the shoot down?
That's a good question. It looks like he was shot down in air-to-air combat, which is different than what people thought. He was dead when he hit the ground. So by the look of it, and this is just based on the information that we have, it looks like he was able to hit his chute out, but that by the time he was down, he was dead. The Bedouins who ultimately buried him. And when around 2009, when we were finally getting the final information to indicate where he actually was and that he had been buried, it sounds like the locals there, based on their tradition, believed that it was their duty to make sure that he was buried very rapidly after he died. And part of that is that those people, essentially, a lot of them just simply went on to their daily lives, everything. And therein lies that big gray area of if only a few people know that he was buried and it wasn't common knowledge, then all of these other pieces of information, everything that crops up, becomes something that you have to look at. And it takes a long time before we're able to actually find out that he was buried somewhere near the crash site.
Where is Jessica Lynch now?
My understanding, she has a daughter. She has a job. She's back here in the U.S. She got her degree, and she's doing well. She's tried very hard to divorce herself from the entire publicity side of the house. She's very honest and also very, she doesn't want to draw attention to herself. And particularly, one of the things that she highlights that I find noble is the fact that she says that I wasn't the hero, right? I didn't fire any of the shots. I was in a vehicle that crashed. I was significantly wounded. I was helped out by Iraqi doctors where I was held until true heroes came and saved my life. And in the meantime, too, some of my soldiers in the 507th who did get wounded or who did die fighting, that those are the real heroes. And so she's been very vocal in terms of calling out the people who she thinks are the true heroes, and she doesn't want to draw attention to herself. But my understanding is that she has a life here back in the United States that is good.
Did the helicopters land on top of the hospital, or how did they get to her from where?
So they landed, it's right outside of the hospital. In the actual video, you see them bringing her out and placing her in the helicopter, and then having her take off. So we had done all of the, we had really good video imagery and pictures of the hospital, as well as, again, some of the information about the hospital itself. So we knew all the right landing, ingress, and egress points and everything to be able to do that. But my understanding is they landed right outside of the hospital. Yeah.
All right, Greg Elder, thank you. You're fabulous.
Thank you all. You've been a great audience. Been a great